Singapore on Thames. Oi, apa ini? Every time when I hear content creators and politicians talk about Singapore this, Singapore that, I get so annoyed. Do you even know what Singapore is all about, let alone Singapore on Thames? I mean, seriously, Singapore River. Get your facts right and get the real deal. Okay. We're gonna do a fun one today. I'm gonna be walking around while filming myself so that you get a tour of the Singapore CBD area while I explain how and why Singapore on Thames is not gonna work. I'm sorry, Britain, and I'm sorry, all the Brexiters. Sorry to disappoint you, but straight from the horse's mouth. And why am I qualified to talk about this? Well, as a Singaporean, as a naturalized Singaporean, who was born in Malaysia, moved to 5 different countries, and spent 7 years in London before I moved back to Singapore recently, well, moved back to Southeast Asia recently. Every time when I hear the words, when I hear British politicians throw around the word Singapore on Thames, I have to stop myself from rolling my eyes. Seriously, like, we are so different. We couldn't be more different. And maybe there are certain things about Singapore that UK politicians could learn from us. But let me just explain the differences and how, if you were to copy well the Singapore model, how could you even go about approaching it? And I'll also talk about some examples of countries who copied the Singapore model and adapted it to suit their culture, history, environment, and geography, and that turned out quite well. Okay, so let's first start talking about how did that term even came about, like who even think about it in the first place. The term came about in 2017, a few months after Brexit, when the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, was interviewed by a German newspaper. And this is really, the topic really was about how could Britain survive after Brexit. And some ideas were thrown around. And Philip Hammond subscribed to the theory that if UK were to survive after Brexit, is to establish closer relationship with EU so that they're more aligned. And then the reporter asked, well, what's the alternative? And Philip Hammond then said, well, you could have a low tax, low regulation environment where it's pro-business. To which the reporters say, oh, like a Singapore on Thames, right on point. And to which I think Philip Hammond didn't really say yes or no. And so the word Singapore on Thames almost came out as a warning as opposed to a model to aspire to. And by the way, that building there, built by the British. You know what, I quite like this spot, so I'm just gonna stay here and do a video. Mistake number one. By calling that regime Singapore on Thames, they're assuming that Singapore is freewheeling and low regulation. So that's really not true. Trust me, Singapore is heavily regulated. The regulations is different from EU. The regulation came from a philosophy and principle of making it really business friendly, making it competitive, and protecting the safety of the citizens and the residents. And subsequently, this is really too long, don't read, a lot of British politicians started throwing around the term Singapore on Thames as if it is a model that London should aspire to. But what really annoys me is those exact same politicians who throw that term around, they tend to be Brexiters who have very minimal, if any, understanding of Singapore. And I think that's why I get really annoyed, because this is my adopted country. And mind you, this is not paid by the Singapore government. This is a complex topic, okay? So forgive me for ranting a little bit. I try to script it, but it's so difficult to script. So I'm just gonna go with the flow while you can enjoy the view behind me. And I might even walk around so that you can enjoy the view while I rant. Low tax regime. Yes, Singapore is a low tax regime. One of the statistics that I love to quote is maximum personal tax rate in Singapore is 22 or 24%. And this is tiered, so it's progressive. So you will only hit 22 to 24 when you earn more than, get this, $1 million Singapore dollar. That's 600,000 pounds, British pound. only if you earn more than 600,000 pounds that you start paying 22% tax. And well, so your effective tax rate is never going to be 22 anyway, because it takes you quite a bit of time to get to $1 million Singapore dollar. But Singapore could afford low tax only because we have sovereign wealth fund. We have compulsory savings, pensions in the form of CPF, Central Provision Fund, that funds the sovereign wealth fund. And the sovereign wealth fund generate a lot of wealth for the country. And, okay, I'll give you some statistics, okay? The sovereign wealth fund in Singapore, GIC and Temasek, they own companies like the DBS Bank, Standard Chartered Bank, Entropic, CapitaLand, Keppel Shipyard, and multinational companies like Klarna, Monzo, Alibaba, Broadgate and Pennington Central in London. And this is equivalent to a person who owned a lot of assets or inherited a lot of assets. He or she doesn't have to do anything. He doesn't have to earn money, and yet he can afford to spend. This is not what UK could afford. UK privatized most of its assets in the 80s and 90s. So my question is, how are you going to acquire those assets back? You need money to acquire those assets back. Frugality. The taxpayers' money are spent sensibly. Governments are not known to splurge on white elephant projects. Projects are run as a tight ship. Cost overrun and project delays happen quite rarely in Singapore. MRTs get built on time and on budget. That level of frugality is a result of a way of running things, a system of thinking. And it's the system itself that's hard to copy, which is why I say if you want to cherry pick Singapore on Thames, chances are you will fail. You might be able to start from smaller initiatives like Keep Singapore Clean or the HDB and celebrate small wins from there. But to think that you can create a financial ecosystem like Singapore within 5 years, which is the term of a government, that's not going to work. Speaking of the term of the government, Singapore is not a one-party system, even though that same party has been governing Singapore since its founding in 1965. There is opposition party, and we're allowed to vote for opposition party. So in that sense, it's a democracy. But there are rules and there are systems, you could call it, that makes it quite hard for the opposition party to win. And I personally actually support that system. I think, this is just my opinion, that consistency in politicians and political system assures investors that whatever you invest, whatever the current government promised you, chances are it's still going to be there 5 years, 10 years, 15 years later. And that level of assurance is very pro-business. I think that would be quite hard for UK to implement. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm just saying as it is, like the system is different. And you have to remember, Singapore is a small country. I'm not talking about just like geographically. When a country is small, it means it's a city-state. It means there is no distinction between national government, federal government, and the local government, which you have in the UK. I think with the new prime minister, with the new potential prime minister, maybe that situation is going to change. Wait, how cute is that? How cute is that? Okay, let's enjoy the view with me, okay? Let's enjoy this view. I think that's going to change, and the Greater London Authority might start to have more power to implement certain initiative that is pro-London, pro-financial industries, and hopefully that will start generating more tax revenue for at least London, and which will then flow on to UK. The geography makes a difference. Singapore is a bloody small country. They were talking about this 老鼠, this rat and cat over here, which is really cute. The geography makes a difference, right? Singapore, you could travel from east to west of Singapore within an hour and a half by car. And that smallness also means you could propose initiatives such as heavily regulated land. Government pretty much own a large percentage of the land, and Singaporeans are used to a 99-year lease when you buy a house, as opposed when you buy a home, as opposed to a 120-year lease that can be renewed. In Singapore, the leases are not renewable, and people are used to not having freehold properties, and that allow the country to preserve its land resources, which is precious in any big cities in the world, not just Singapore, not just London, even in places like New York, I'm sure. The other difference, Singapore has 6.1 million people. The Greater London area has 9.1 million people. And the ethnic makeup is also very different. In Singapore, you have pretty much 3 or 4 major races. And in London, it's such a cosmopolitan melting pot. And that ethnic makeup is important because the more diverse it is, the more important it is for you to unite a diverse group, to have a city identity or national identity. I would say generally, you can never get this perfect, but Singaporeans really do identify themselves as Singaporean first and Chinese ethnic as a second. So I'm ethnic Chinese, but I definitely identify myself closer with a Singaporean Indian or Singaporean Malay than a Chinese person from China. That's how strong the identity is. And that identity is important because every time when you try to implement certain changes, if there is no unified identity, it makes it really difficult for people to buy in to any ideas that you might want to push through and sacrifices that they might have to make. I don't get sick of this view. I've been coming to this spot since I was in my 20s, actually. Where was I? Expectation. Oh my goodness, this is a big one. Expectation to work hard. The social welfare system is minimal, and I actually support that because it prevents free rider problem. And you are just expected to work hard. It also means if you have any sort of psychological disadvantage or physical disadvantage, it can be quite hard for you to get funding or social support, like harder here as compared to the UK. I mean, I don't personally have that experience, but if you know of somebody who is in that circumstances, please leave a comment below. I mean, I just think as the UK government budget deficit grow wider and wider, that part might have to go, even though that was the promise to UK people in the first place. The biggest thing of what I call the Singaporeanism is this idea of being pragmatic. Singapore politicians don't really subscribe to any capitalism, socialism sort of idea. It's just what works. Pragmatism. The discussion is less about, is this capitalist or socialist? The discussion is more about, does it work? And how do we make it work? And which is also why sometimes I just love working with Singaporean. They don't beat around the bush. It's just get it done. And as a result of that, there's absolutely zero tolerance for nimibism. If anybody ever wants to say, oh, not in my backyard, they will be frowned upon in Singapore, which makes pushing certain initiatives through a lot easier as compared to the UK. So I'm not sure if UK is able to adopt this philosophy and initiative. I mean, certainly not a one-party, well, it's not a one-party system, but a consistent government. I just don't see that in the UK. Like, even if you have the same party, you keep changing prime minister because of internal disagreement. That's very upsetting, unsettling for potential investors and even for people who live there. Look, when I first moved to London, I thought I was going to be there forever. And after 7 years, I just thought, no. countries that copy Singapore and copy it well. Case in point, Deng Xiaoping, and people still leave flowers. It's kind of really cute. He visited Singapore in 1979, I believe, and 1978. There you go. And so this is what a lot of people don't know. I mean, he copied the Singapore model. And how he managed to copy the Singapore model was he picked an unwanted area south of China that's really far from Beijing, which means it's far away from the federal government influence, and say, well, we can just use that as an experiment. And China is so big, Shenzhen is not considered a very big place for overall China as a country. And so he pretty much started building business park, implemented rules and regulations that are very pro-business, effectively make it capitalistic. And it was so successful that the rest of the countries started to copy it. And then this idea of being pro-business and still highly regulated spread to the rest of China. I would say it's probably easier for China to copy the Singapore model because first of all, it's reasonably monoculture. Large percentage of the population is Han Chinese, and the fact that 70% of Singapore population is Chinese as well, it makes it a much easier sell culturally. The other country that copied Singapore well is South Korea. Now, I'm not that familiar with South Korea, so I don't know exactly what South Korea copied, but I know they follow certain sort of Singapore mentality for some of their industry. So if you are South Korean or you're familiar with South Korea, how South Korea copied Singapore, leave a comment below. And of course, Dubai. Dubai is like the famous example. They copy Singapore, right? The sovereign wealth fund, keeping the oil reserve, make it really low tax. It has even lower tax than Singapore because they have the oil reserve, so they have the luxury. And even the airlines, like Emirates Airline, is, in my opinion, a copy of the Singapore airline, and they copied it and they make it even better. And is it possible for UK to copy Singapore? This is my opinion. I think it is possible, but you probably have to be a bit less ambitious to start with. I remember this river right here used to be dirty and filthy. I used to go to that building because that used to be the immigration office when I was 6 years old, and I used to have to come here with my mom quite a bit. This used to be filled with just rubbish and it stank. And keep Singapore clean is a long-running exercise since the 60s, but when I was growing up in the 80s, I could still remember this lion mascot of Keep Singapore Clean, and it was successful. The whole initiative started off because the cleanliness is a public health issue, right? So, and it's quite an easy win. It's quite an easy thing to implement, and people all agree that you need to keep this place clean. But keeping this place clean also means you can't litter, you can't dispose your rubbish irresponsibly, you can't spit, you have to remember to flush your toilet. Yes, true story. When I was in the 80s, they keep reminding people that you have to flush your toilet. Nowadays, you don't have to because all the toilets are automatic anyway. So start from something small. Start from something like keep London clean, keep it safe. And I think racial harmony is another big one that London really needs to pay attention to. I don't subscribe to the theory that you should send refugees home. I mean, if they're already in that country, if they're there legally, then, well, you granted them asylum status, then, you open the door and you invited them in. You can't go back on your promise. But could you tighten the requirements? Yes, of course. And Singapore has very tight immigration rule. But regardless of what the immigration policy is or was, I think it's extremely important to ensure that different races in London and in the UK get along with each other. because that sort of racial tension sucks up a lot of energy to think about how can you make London more pro-business. I mean, if I'm a business investor, I wouldn't want to invest in a place where somebody might trash my business because of my race or because person A doesn't like person B. It sends out the wrong signal in London and in the UK. And I think we have more in common with each other than we have differences. And it is a contentious topic, but I think it's something worth discussing. Another thing that Singapore does that I don't think UK will ever do, well, unlikely for UK to do, Singapore government openly acknowledge race in public policy. In our identification card, your race is stated, whether you are Chinese, Indian, Malay, or other, as they call it. So if you don't fall into any of this category. And I think it's precisely because we're willing to talk about race that we can start discussing policies that may support certain races in order to almost do it like a social welfare system. I think this is my own personal opinion. I think it's very difficult for UK to talk about race because before you even talk about race, you have to talk about class, which is, I call it the invisible hand, the invisible social hand in the UK. The class system is so prevalent. Even before you open your mouth, people would kind of classify you, which class do you belong to? And obviously, as soon as you open your mouth, they could tell from your accent which class do you belong to. So there is a lot of disharmony which has to be solved in the first place before London can even think about being a Singapore on Thames. So yeah, I think I ranted enough. I hope you learned something new. And yes, if you're a white content creator, I'm sorry. Like, unless you've done your homework about Singapore, please do not use Singapore as a way to increase your views. Like, it really annoys me how many non-Singaporean content creators got the concept of Singapore wrong. It really annoys me because it damages, in my opinion, it sends the wrong image of Singapore, an incorrect image of Singapore. So just please stop it. So anyway, if you learned something new from my video, click a like and subscribe. I would love to hear your comment below. See you next time.